All right, here's where we're at. There's a guy at ADHD Whiskey. His name is Matt. He was watching a whiskey review on our second channel, The Whiskey Vault, and he took issue with an offhand remark I made about bourbon barrels and naturally challenged me to a fight.
Looking for a fight.
All in good fun. It's actually a very funny video, but we're gonna react to it because Daniel's gone and we gotta make a video.
Welcome back to ADHD Whiskey. My name is Matt.
Hi, Matt.
If this is your first time here, welcome to ADHD Whiskey.
No, it's not my first time. I've seen your channel before. It's a good channel.
I'm wearing the sweater vest again, so I appear classy and elegant, and people take me seriously.
Continue.
But I ditched the shirt because today, I'm looking for a fight.
You're not the only one with tickets to the gun show, Matt. This is gonna be harder because it's my left hand.
Before we get started, I don't want to get this twisted. I am a huge fan, both figuratively and literally, of the Whiskey Vault and the Whiskey Tribe. I love Daniel and Rex.
Thank you.
I love them. I honestly probably have an unhealthy love for them. But there's a problem. Like usual, I watched the Whiskey Vault video, and after they're done conversing, Rex says something that I had to rewind and listen to probably 5 times.
5 times! Okay.
The first 3 times were to make sure that's what he said. The other 2 times were to make sure he was serious. And then I watched it another 10 times to...
That's 15 times!
get me so upset.
Oh man, we don't want you to be upset. That's not why we make... Jesus! All right.
Jab, jab. Oh, those are 2 slow jabs. Jab, jab, just to get you comfortable, thinking that I don't have the speed or the power. Oh, bango. The right hand. It's where the power comes from. Did you deserve to get beat up? Maybe not physically. Maybe not physically. But if you would have lasted 13 seconds, then you would have overcome my main weakness, which is early fatigue due to my morbid obesity and general lack of health.
That's pretty funny.
I'm going to play a short snippet from the Whiskey Tribe video today.
Okay, it's a video about a snippet. Cool.
Try not to go into cardiac arrest due to my blood pressure. I am here to do only one thing today. Unless, of course, Rex wants to throw down.
I want to throw down. Yeah.
In which case, I'm here to do 2 things today. But the number 1 thing is to defend the honor of America's native spirit.
Okay.
Bourbon.
It's Woodinville.
Smells very good.
Triple barrel pot distilled whiskey. So technically this is a bourbon, but they start in heavily toasted, lightly charred American oak.
Yeah.
Then they're moved to used bourbon, and then they're moved to Islay Scotch barrels.
Oh, interesting.
But it's a bourbon mash bill.
Well, okay, but it's not bourbon.
Because of all the different things they're doing, yeah.
It's not new oak. Yeah. But damn, it smells good. This
Washington.
is why bourbon shouldn't have the new oak requirement. Just saying.
You son of a bitch. I didn't think I was going to get this fired up. America.
Okay, so the blended whiskey we're talking about is essentially a bourbon or finished bourbon, but it can't be categorized that way because it was finished in other barrels. Maybe the distillery did other things that prevent it from being called a bourbon, like barrel entry proof, but it sounds like it's just a pot still bourbon that met some finishing barrels.
But let me tell you right now, every time the cork comes out of a bottle of bourbon whiskey, a little bit of America comes out with it, because bourbon is America's native spirit. And if you want to touch it or change it or alter its rules,
I do. Not what you think, but yeah.
Make it different, or take its name and slander it.
No, that's not a thing.
Or take our precious liquid gold and rectify it. Or rectify it. Rectify it. You son of a bitch. You rectifying son of a bitch. You stay out of it. You don't make the rules. The rules have already been made. You're either bourbon or you're not bourbon.
Okay.
See the color on that? See the color on that Wild Turkey 101? That color doesn't come from used barrels. Bourbon has rules. It has rules. Bourbon has history and has rules. And those rules and that history is what makes bourbon so great. That's why it is America's native spirit. The color, the flavor, the natural filtration from the charcoal, that is bourbon. What do you mean exactly when you say that bourbon shouldn't need to be aged in new charred oak barrels? What do you mean?
Daniel said this whiskey went into a heavily toasted, lightly charred barrel. I assume that the lightly charred is enough to meet the charred barrel requirement for bourbon. I don't know, probably, maybe, there wasn't a lot of detail there. So this whiskey is aged in new oak, but it's not only new oak. It's finished in a couple of other barrels. I'm annoyed because I know that there's a ton of people that will not pick up this with a blended whiskey label. It's a bourbon mash bill. It's initially aged in new oak, and I love what the bourbon does in the pot still, but the additional finishing barrels screw up a bourbon classification. That's why I think the bourbon classification shouldn't be limited to new oak. Or to say that more clearly, an only new oak requirement. I think distillers should be able to finish their bourbon barrels in additional barrels after aging in new oak and still be clearly, officially, unambiguously characterized as a finished bourbon. That's what I mean exactly. So if I get this right, I put my nose in a whiskey with a bourbon mash bill that was initially aged in new oak barrels. It smells amazing, and you think that I'm saying this whiskey is a good example of why bourbon should not require new American oak barrels. All right, so I'm gonna give some benefit of the doubt. I can see how you got there from the snippet. It was an offhand remark as we started the review, and I've been on the internet long enough to know the value of fully contextualized, comprehensive, and exhaustive clarity at all times, but it usually makes content tedious and boring, and without it, I get it, you get things like... So, to be clear, I think all bourbon should first be aged in new oak. I would hope that goes without saying because, you know, I smelled a whiskey that was initially aged in new oak and loved it, so it wouldn't really make sense for me to say that a new oak barrel is stupid. But that's all me. I should have been more clear. I could have been more clear.
Brown sugar, caramel, sweet, charred oak.
So those classic bourbon flavors, yes, they can only be achieved in a new oak barrel. We've done several episodes showing the effects of new oak barrels. 30 yards in that direction is aging whiskey, both in new oak and used oak, and the difference of a new oak barrel is undeniably bourbony. So we don't actually disagree on bourbon getting aged in new oak, which is a little awkward because your 11-minute video is basically convincing people that I smelled a whiskey that was aged in new oak, loved it, and then used it as proof that new oak barrels are dumb. Again, benefit of the doubt. I'm seeing where you're coming from here. Daniel says...
They start in heavily toasted, lightly charred American oak.
Heavily toasted, lightly charred barrel. I know it's new. When a barrel is used, you don't reference the char. You say what was originally in the barrel, which is what he says for the finishing barrels.
Then they're moved to used bourbon, and then they're moved to Islay Scotch barrels.
A used bourbon barrel and an Islay Scotch barrel. And then I say, but not new oak. That muddies the waters. We're communicating in shorthand here, incomplete thoughts that we understand well enough because we've done this all of the times, but it's not good for the viewer. It's sloppy, it's confusing because we're communicating for each other, but not the viewer. So in my head, when we're talking about bourbon, new oak is short for a new charred American oak barrel, period. No other barrels. I should have said not only new oak. So we're gonna fix it right now. For you,
It's not
Only.
new oak. Yeah. But damn, it smells good. This
Washington.
is why bourbon shouldn't have the
Only.
new oak requirement.
to put your fears to rest, you don't have to watch it a 16th time. We do in fact live in a world where bourbon should be aged in new oak. The sky is blue, grass is green, and Daniel is a seat sniffer. These are universally established truths that we all agree on. But don't worry, we can still juice this for content. Because what could have ended with a simple response to your video about my off-the-cuff, unclear, and incomplete snippet, you found yourself a little soapbox, a little rhetorical flourish about the long-established and infallible rules of bourbon.
Here's a little bit of a challenge. Let's say you walk into a fine clothing establishment to go purchase some clothes to make you feel fancy and special. And when you go into Kohl's, you go to the rack and you grab a blue t-shirt with a picture of Harry and the Hendersons on it, and it's $6.80. Large is your size. You get home, throw on the Harry and Hendersons t-shirt, and whoop, too small. I thought I was a large. I thought I was a large. What the heck happened?
I do Kohl's better than you.
What happened was, there's no rules. You can buy any t-shirt off the shelf that's a large, and it could be half the size of a large. There is no rules. Large, extra large, extra, extra large. To make life easier, you need rules. I'm drawing a line in the metaphorical YouTube sand, and I double, triple, quadruple dare you to cross that line and try to change the rules, or even mention that those rules should be changed.
I think the rules should be changed. Look, man, if you're looking for someone to bask in the bought wisdom and sanctity of bureaucratic rules, I'm not that guy. Let's look at the sacred bourbon rules and how I actually think they should change, but my position isn't what you claim in your video. You know, the one with me smelling a new oak aged whiskey, loving it, and then allegedly using it as an example of why I think new oak barrels shouldn't be needed to make bourbon. Again, on me. I totally own that. But we're here, we're playing the game, you're feeling froggy, you're taking a leap, and I am diving headfirst into those sweet, sweet meats.
Shut your mouth.
But it's all in good fun. Matt's video is very funny. It's met with the good-natured ball busting you intended, but this is for the lulz. So here we go.
This episode is sponsored by Helix Mattresses. These are very comfortable mattresses delivered to your door after you take a very simple, very straightforward sleep quiz to make sure that you're getting the right mattress delivered to you. For example, I am a side sleeper, so I went through the sleep quiz and it got my preferences, and I like it soft. I like the cush. I like the cush. Don't judge. I enjoy the cush. So it paired me up with the Sunset. I got the Luxe version because I'm a big boy. You get the mattress, it comes in the box, you take it out of the packaging and it goes thump, and you get 100 days to sleep on it, make sure that it's just right for you. If it's not the exact right mattress for you, they will come pick up the mattress for free and give you a full refund. Beyond that, they also have a 10-year warranty and financing options, so you can make sure that it's convenient, whatever your situation may be. So several of us around the studio have had Helix mattresses for many months. One notable exception, Fancy Dan does not have a Helix.
Hello?
Hey, Dan, what are you doing? I'm out in the...
Nah, I don't care. Guess what I'm doing, Dan? I'm laying on my Helix mattress. Do you have a Helix, Dan?
No, I know it.
No, I didn't think so. Everybody else has a Helix, Dan. You know why you don't have a Helix? You know what you did, Dan.
What did I do?
You know what you did.
No, Rex, I don't know what I did.
There you are, laying
in discomfort while I am just swallowed up.
by the plushness of the Helix mattress, Dan. Can you hear the comfort?
For Dan?
You can't hear comfort.
Can you hear it now?
Dan? Are you thinking, Dan? Are you thinking about what you...
All right, Fancy Dan, you know what you did, and you can dig yourself out of this hole. You want to get a Helix mattress and improve your life? First, apologize. Second, go to helixsleep.com/whiskey to get up to $200. I'm not paying for this. You will get up to $200 off. Plus 2 free pillows. Where did today's bourbon rules come from? So this is an article from VinePair. It's titled, Love Bourbon, You Can Thank the Timber Industry and the Great Depression. The actual ruling we're talking about for the rules for bourbon barrels was enforced on July 1st, 1938 by the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Trade Bureau. That's the TTB. This was the era of the Great Depression. And among the lagging industries, timber, turns out the timber industry was fairly active in Congress. Tickling and needling around for tax breaks and subsidies, the lobbying was so bad that when the unstoppable FDR tried to veto a major expansion of the tax breaks in 1943, he and later Kennedy and then Carter failed. Suffice to say, lobbying from a timber industry looking to increase jobs and revenue may have well influenced the 1938 ruling dictating the use of charred new oak barrels. So, the lumber lobby essentially dictated the rules for bourbon back in whatever the hell. They weren't going for a category-defining flavor of the American spirit. Their priority was simply money, which is, ironically, the flavor of the American spirit.
These are America's rules and you back off. You stay out of it. You don't make the rules. The rules have already been made.
Why are you so testy? Why would you be so personally offended by me suggesting changes to the bourbon guidelines? Then I did a little research. Turns out Matt's family has deep ties to the lumber lobby going way back. Exhibit A. This is a super legitimate photo I uncovered showing Matt's ancestor, a lumber lobbyist, making deals with congressional leaders back in 19-something. Food for thought. So according to Matt, the established rules for bourbon are infallible, beyond reproach.
Dare you to cross that line and try to change the rules, or even mention that those rules should be changed?
Did you know, according to Matt's established rules, there's no minimum time requirement for aging bourbon? Before you get in the comments and say, he didn't know what he's talking about, it has to be 2 years. No. There is no minimum age for bourbon. Straight bourbon, 2 years. Bottled and bond bourbon, 4 years. Just bourbon, no minimum age. Thanks, Matt.
You son of a bitch.
So why is this? Because lumber companies never cared about making quality bourbon. When the rules were being made, Matt's ancestral lumber oligarchy just cared about one thing. How many new barrels could they force whiskey makers to buy? I'm not saying Matt is a shill for the lumber lobby. I'm not saying Matt has inherited an ill-begotten wood-fueled empire. I'm not saying he's in the top 1% of the lumber industry with a monopolistic stranglehold on hard-working bourbon makers. I'm not saying he's a shadowy leader of an oaky cabal. I'm definitely not saying Matt is a mouthpiece for big wood.
Shut your mouth.
Team Trees? This guy is more like, fuck, hell, Matt, the anger, man. The anger. There's also no minimum barrel size for bourbon either. So according to Matt, you can take this unaged bourbon. It meets the distillation requirements of a bourbon. It's more than 51% corn, entering this charred new American oak barrel at no more than 125 proof. And you can age it for as long as it takes Matt to flex those sweet meats. Do it again. That's not America, Matt. That's barely even Canada. According to your rules, not only is there no minimum age requirement for bourbon, there's also no proportional relationship between aging casks and finishing casks. So I could take this real bourbon, according to Matt, and finish this in a used Lafroig barrel for, let's say, 20 years. That spirit could then be called a bourbon whiskey finished in an Islay Scotch barrel.
You're either bourbon or you're not bourbon.
Block. Spin move. Wow.
The best thing that ever came out of the clothing industry was men's sizing for pants. You have the waist and then the inseam, and they're measured in inches. Guess what? That is accurate. Bourbon is the men's pant sizing of whiskey. There are rules. You know what you're getting yourself into.
Your new pants have holes in them, Matt. That's all I'm saying. The laws you defend are incomplete and unclear. In my opinion, you're not really defending bourbon, you're defending the idea of bourbon. And any self-respecting whiskey drinker should be allowed to consider what makes sense and what is nonsense. Bourbon is massive, it's iconic, and deservedly so. Some of my favorite whiskeys are bourbons. We make and sell bourbon. But I think we should clearly identify and protect the things that work for bourbon, which is most of the things, and fix a few of the things that don't work. You know what else isn't strictly bourbon? According to those sacred bourbon guidelines, this whiskey you reviewed on October 19th of 2021.
Bardstown Bourbon Company, Ferrand. It's like a jolt of bourbon energy just pulsing through my veins.
I know that's just a snippet, but accuracy matters, and we should respect your rules enough to say the category that the distillery was legally obligated to put on the label in its entirety. I think you meant to say it's like a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey finished in cognac barrels, energy pulsing through my veins. Obviously, taking a short offhand remark like that and nitpicking it as a complete incomprehensive thought is silly. We've always said makers should be transparent and clear about what's in their bottle, but this isn't how to do it. Look, the technical, rule-abiding reality of the situation is even more weird than I've described. Google, is finished bourbon still bourbon? And you're gonna find an answer like, bourbon finished in a secondary barrel type is no longer bourbon. It is something called a specialty spirit. You know that popular bourbon known as Angel's Envy? Under the rules, that is not a bourbon. They can't even call it a bourbon. They can't even call it a finished bourbon because there is no category for finished bourbon in the rules. Things like that are officially called something like a whiskey specialty, a distilled spirit specialty, a specialty spirit. I think we should just split the difference and call it special sauce. And the best a distiller can do with special sauce is cite the process they used to make, in this case, Angel's Envy, and put it on the label. That process started with the bourbon, so they're allowed to put bourbon as the word of a description. But make no mistake, the rules say it's not a bourbon. That Ferrand that you're so fond of, that's not a bourbon either. Again, the label can use the word bourbon to describe the process they used to make it, but rule-abiding whiskey drinkers will know that it's not a real bourbon. According to the rules, any bourbon that touches a finishing barrel after aging in new oak immediately stops being a bourbon and becomes something called a whiskey specialty, specialty spirit, blah, blah, blah. It's confusing, right? Like there's some important pieces missing? That's my point. Breaking Bourbon has a really good article about this called Bourbon, the Case of Mistaken Identity. I encourage you to go read the article. Here are some highlights. To be labeled bourbon, you can't add anything else. Fine. By law, Bourbon must be aged in a new charred oak container. However, we are seeing a tidal wave of bourbons that have been finished in additional barrels that once held something else. So here's where it gets messy. Technically, these products are often classified under a different classification entirely, known as distilled spirit specialty or whiskey specialties. That's the special sauce I'm talking about. Whiskey specialties allow for the addition of coloring, flavoring, blending materials, and in the case of barrel finishing, unfortunately there is no clear separation between the two, creating a gray area that consumers as a whole are not equipped to navigate. In my opinion, I don't think a new oak-aged bourbon finished in additional barrels is the same thing as a specialty spirit with artificial coloring, added flavoring, bottled at less than 80 proof. If you really want to protect the core of bourbon that we all know and love, bourbon distillers need to be able to experiment with finishing barrels and consistently get official label approval for bourbon or finished bourbon. That idea of exploration and testing the limits is absolutely an American value. We traveled an ocean to get away from the kinds of unquestionable authority and rules that you seem to love.
Rules. Rules? Rules. 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 Rules, 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 rules.
You pop the cork and say America, but you gotta remember, explorers brought us here, pioneers made us a home, revolutionaries established our independence. None of those people had a hard-on for the rules or boundaries. When it comes to bourbon, I think we should honor the achievements of those that came before us, and we should protect those things that are clearly working. But I don't think we can or should stop there. I think bourbon should have a minimum age requirement. Let's call it 6 months. I think bourbon should have a minimum barrel size. Let's call it 5 gallons. I think bourbon should not automatically turn into special sauce once it's finished. And if there needs to be another official category called finished bourbon, so be it. And in my opinion, that category should meet all of the criteria of regular bourbon with the added option for finishing barrels that get disclosed somewhere on the bottle. And I don't think a finished bourbon should be able to sit in a finishing barrel for more time than it aged in its new original oak barrel. With better guidelines for bourbon and finished bourbon, we can more effectively address the colored flavored sub 80 proof bottles that say bourbon on the label. If you agree or if you disagree, leave a comment. I'm interested to see what you think. I'm sure there's reasonable people who do not agree with me, but let's see where we're at. I hate to do this to you, Matt, but it's time for me to unveil my ultimate finishing move. I'm gonna tap my brave, reliable, unquestionably loyal partner, my co-host and friend, a gentleman, a scholar, an exquisite specimen of hobbity goodness. Yeah, what are you doing?
I am updating all the bottle tracking and holding and claims and pickup spreadsheets.
Cool. All right. So, are you ready to defend my honor against...
Oh, yeah. It feels like he picked a fight with you, and that's really none of my business.
So, you are on Matt's team. My God. It all makes sense now. You're in cahoots with Matt.
I have no idea what you're talking
You're in cahoots!
There's no such thing as...
You're in cahoots! Cahoots! Hey.
Hey?
You wanna go into a battle with me?
What battle?
It's like an internet slap fight, but about whiskey.
But I don't know anything about whiskey.
Can you hold like a sword?
So, what are you gonna do with that?
Okay, so 2 things. I want to give respect and a thank you to Matt. I actually don't know what he believes about a lot of this stuff. His argument was accidentally a straw man based on my sloppy communication, so nobody be shitty to Matt. I just used this as an opportunity to tackle a very nerdy subject, and his video was a spoonful of sugar that helped this go down. Matt, if you are ever in Austin, I look forward to raising a glass with you. We'll go a few rounds, and then we'll go a few rounds.